Good evening, everyone. Great to see you here in person and also over there remotely in the comfort of your homes. And welcome to the third of the lectures of Map Mayhem. This is a map dedicated to looking at the maps of the Great American West, specifically those maps that have something to do with Colorado. The first one that we had was about the cartographic roots of Colorado. So we took a look at from the point of view of historical from 1540s all the way up to 1861. Then we got a little bit closer to looking at the continent spine with Chris Lane talking about the Rocky Mountains. And so now we're going to take a look at how military and diplomatic events in the between the United States and its southern neighbor in Mexico affected also a region, a part of Colorado. By the end of 1847, at the end of the Mexican-American War, diplomats from both sides of the border, United States and Mexico, got together in a small little town called Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is now part of actually Mexico City. It's no longer in the outskirts. And there they discussed all sorts of things that were needed in order to end the war. So there were articles about debt and about what to do with Indian attacks. But there's also the very thorny issue of the boundary and what to do with it that actually separated the two countries. And attached to the treaty was this commercially successful but very flawed map that started a series of negotiations that lasted for decades and decades. In fact, I will tend to say that even after 175 years, the boundary between Mexico and the United States is still not firm. There's still issues with the river that tries to change course and all that. And so this period that followed the treaty in terms of cartographers and diplomats and engineers and all the work that went into the cartography that defined the boundary is exactly what our speaker is going to be concentrated today. So Stephen Hoffenberg, who was a very successful medical doctor until a few years ago, that when he decided to devote himself to just maps, he loves maps of the Southwest and the Indian country. He has now put a lot of time in order to talk to us about how the boundary between the U.S. and Mexico came about. So, Stephen, tell us where to draw the line. Okay.
Thank you, Angel, and I'd like to thank History Colorado and the Rocky Mountain Map Society. If you can't hear me, let me know. Okay, I'll get started and I'll try and talk into the microphone, but we're going to talk tonight about drawing the line, and let's see if I got this right. And we're going to talk about how the border was created, the current border between Mexico and the United States, as well as the historic borders which preceded it. We're lucky in History Colorado to have right now an exhibit on the borderlands of Southern Colorado. And interestingly, within that exhibit, there's pages from the original Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was the treaty that created an end to armed conflict between the U.S. and Mexico. And it had a profound and lasting effect on both the nations of Mexico as well as the United States, and most importantly, a profound effect on the people that lived in the Southwest. So we have a special guest here tonight. It's my wife, and she's from a very old Southern Colorado and New Mexico family with a really interesting history, and that family was really rolled over by the border. So in the Q&A period, we can talk about that, or afterwards, if you can grab her, she'd be happy to tell you what's a very interesting family history. Now, within that treaty was Article 5 that laid out the land cessions of Mexico to the U.S., and they gave up 125,000 square miles of land. That was 55% of the nation of Mexico. And attached to the treaty was the map that Angel referenced, and that map was the 1847 Disturnell map, better known as the treaty map. Now, tonight, what I want to do is talk about how the borders evolved in the Southwest, We're going to look at it through the lens of cartography. This is the Map Society, so that's the perspective we take. But I have to be honest with you, I've always viewed maps as the visual representation of history. I can't separate the two, and we'll be getting a lot of history tonight. We're going to take a dive into Article 5, and we're going to look at the specific errors in the map that threatened renewed war between Mexico and the United States and required modifications of that by treaty. And then we'll close out with a little discussion about how the boundary survey actually worked. Now, if you attended these Map Mayhem meetings, you'll recognize this map. This goes way back. This is a Sansón from 1656. And there are several points I'd like to make about the map. First of all, Spanish claims at that time went from coast to coast, from Spanish Florida to California, and it was uninterrupted. The Mississippi River was unknown at that time. And you had this vast New Mexico in this map, which kind of just trailed off to the north without any border on that. In 1689, this Cornelli map reflected changes in geography and land claims. And what you see is that you now have a Mississippi River, and that is dramatically misplaced to the west. And that's going to cause some confusion later in terms of French claims in North America. And in addition, when you look at detail in this map, you can see not only was the Mississippi misplaced, but the Rio Grande crossed land claimed by the French. This particular map had a well-developed Rio Grande Valley. It also had El Paso, which is about right here. And El Paso was developed later. El Paso was a town on the river at a strategic crossing. It was a very defensible place because it was where there was a canyon and the river came out between the mountains. And it was also there to maintain and defend the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, which was the royal road to the interior. Again, there was no northern boundary. And what you see here is that French claims now split the country. You had Spanish Florida to the east, you had New Spain to the west. Now, modern cartography in terms of New Spain really began in about 1804. And a fellow named Xander Von Humboldt, who was an international intellectual, very well thought of, he's considered the father of modern geography, towards South America. On his way home, he stopped in Mexico City. He was very well thought of, and he got complete access to the archives in Mexico City, which was very unusual at the time. The Spanish were very protective of their information. And he drew this map here. That's the manuscript copy of his map, based on what he could gather from the archives. And this map is very important because it became the standard map of the Southwest for the next 35 years. So as we look at maps going forward, you're going to see Humboldt cartography in all of them. Now, this was the published form of the map. And interestingly, when he went back to Europe, he stopped to meet with another intellectual at the time, Thomas Jefferson. And he gave a copy of that manuscript map to Thomas Jefferson. This one today lives in the Library of Congress and is on their website. It's 2 slides. Sorry. Oh, okay. I'm a little impaired here, I guess. Not really. Okay. Now, you know, when you look at Humboldt's maps, and I did skip one, I apologize. Nope, we're just going in the wrong direction here. Okay. These are Humboldt's maps. This was his publication. Okay. This was his publication here. And he gave that map to Jefferson, and that geography immediately appeared in Zebulon Pike's map of 1810, and also in Aaron Arrowsmith's map of 1810. And you don't need to really be a cartographer to see that this is exactly reproduced from Humboldt's earlier map. Now, on Humboldt's map, they didn't really have a clear eastern border for New Spain. And as I mentioned, there was confusion about the western border of the US and particularly of Louisiana, which was purchased by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. And so if you don't know where the border is, you take the most aggressive position you can. And this was the American claims to the US boundary at the time, which included all of Spanish Texas. Try this one. Now, that really was a problem. And in 1819, we have the first formalized border between the US and New Spain. And it was embodied in the Adams-Onus Treaty. And what happened was Spain gave up its claims to land in Spanish Florida, and the US gave up its claims to Spanish Texas. And what we have here is the Adams-Onus Treaty line. Now, this is looking at a map from 1822, the Tanner map of North America. And by the way, just to let you know, it's Humboldt geography in the Southwest. So he really used that, although it took 10 years for him to actually develop this map. The border itself went up the Sabine River to the Red River, west to the 100th longitude, then north to the Arkansas River, to the headwaters of the Arkansas River, and then straight up to the 42nd parallel, which is the current border between Oregon and California. Now, this border lasted for about 25 years, and it was a solid border until the Mexican-American War. Now, back to New Mexico for just a minute. I mentioned El Paso. El Paso was established in 1659, and it really was a part of New Mexico. In 1821, New Spain gained its independence from Spain and became the Republic of New Mexico in 1824. And about that time, there was a renewed interest in looking at the borders of the internal provinces of what was now Mexico, and really looking at how the different provinces related to each other. The historic province of Nuevo Vizcaya was divided into Chihuahua, Durango, and a territory of New Mexico. And El Paso at that time became placed in Chihuahua. And that's going to become really key in our conversation later. And the boundary between Chihuahua and New Mexico was a line drawn from east to west through the town of El Paso. Now, if you look at what that looked like on the map, this is a wonderful map. This is an 1828 map. Again, it is taken directly from Tanner. Tanner was based on Humboldt, but this was an American publisher that printed this map in Spanish. And what you see when you look at the detail here is you see El Paso, which is about right in here. And it was south of the border, about 8 miles to New Mexico. And it was above this line here. It's the 32nd parallel. We're going to really talk about that parallel quite a bit. Wonderful map. Now, in 1833, to move the story forward, Chihuahua, which bordered New Mexico, wanted to get a map of Chihuahua. And they went to a fellow named Pedro Garcia Conde and asked him to actually finish a map which was underway. And this was a very skilled cartographer. Conde was probably the preeminent cartographer in Mexico at the time. He was a military man. He was a geographer. He taught mathematics at the military academy. And most importantly, he would later become the commissioner of the boundary survey representing Mexico. They placed the northern boundary of Chihuahua at 32 degrees and 25 minutes. Now, the last thing I want to say about Conde in this context is he was also tasked later on with developing a map of Mexico, and he did. And he put this map together. The actual manuscript has been lost, unfortunately, but he had this one surreptitiously published in London before the Mexican-American War. And what's important to me about this map is that all the previous maps of El Paso showed El Paso above the 32nd parallel. But in Conde's 1845 map, he had it properly placed below the 32nd parallel, and the longitude was correct as well. And what I'm getting at here is this guy Conde went into negotiations later in the border survey, knowing exactly what the defects were in all the American available maps. And he really was the most qualified person in those discussions. Now let's go to the other part of the eye of the storm, Texas, because this is really a lot about Texas and New Mexico. Texas was established in 1827, and it was colonized to oppose French incursions from the east. Remember, the French were in Louisiana. They were putting pressure on what New Spain considered its territory. And in 1805, they defined borders for what was the province of Texas. Now, this is a map here of the original province of Texas. It was published later, but the borders are accurate. It utilized the Adams-Onus Treaty line up the Sabine River to the Red River, but then continued west to a mountain range, and it's labeled on this map the Guadalupe and Sacramento Mountains, and it went to the Nueces River, not the Rio Grande, but the Nueces. And if you look at this 1840 Brouet map, you can see that heart-shaped Texas on this map. And this is about where it sat. It sat a distance from the Rio Grande, which was down here. Now, in 1835, Texans that were Anglos from the United States that had colonized Texas and Tejanos, native Texans, rebelled against the central government in Mexico. And it was part of a more generalized discontent and uprising called the Federalist War in Mexico. And Santa Anna, who was the president, was considered oppressive. And the Texans felt that way, but there was really also a very strong feeling about slavery in Texas. People had gone to Texas with the promise they could hold slaves. And they had a cotton culture and a cattle culture that was heavily dependent on slavery. But slavery was abolished in 1829 in Mexico, and the Texans really felt that this would ultimately become a challenge and resisted a centralized government in Mexico City. Santa Anna sent troops to Texas. They came into conflict at Gonzales, Texas, and after initial victories at San Antonio, the Alamo, and at Goliad, and these were brutal victories, Santa Anna was defeated at San Jacinto and captured 2 days later. While in captivity, he signed 2 agreements, and they're now termed the Treaties of Velasco. One was public, which basically said that the Mexican troops would withdraw to behind the Rio Grande River. And the private one said that Santa Anna, when returned to Mexico, would try and facilitate the acceptance of a delegation from Texas and an independent Texas Republic. He was unable to make any promises, and he didn't. It was very carefully worded. But what was really important was that as soon as these agreements were signed, there was a Texas Boundary Act, which enlarged dramatically the boundaries of Texas. And equally important, Mexico never accepted these agreements. They stated that these treaties were signed under duress. He was a captive at the time. And by the way, from an international law point of view, they were correct. You can't, get someone to sign a treaty in that state. But most importantly, the Congress of Mexico, did I just do that? Never accepted those treaties. They weren't passed. Now, this is the boundaries that Texas claimed, and they're a little hard to see. This is an Emery map from 1844, And it shows the new boundaries of Texas. And this is the boundaries that they claimed. So it was the Adams-Onus treaty line here, and it went across the 42nd parallel, but then up the Rio Grande River to the headwaters of the Rio Grande. They didn't exactly know where that was, and then up to the 42nd parallel. And you get this classic large stovepipe configured Texas. And it's important to recognize that all of the major ski areas in Colorado were included in Texas at the time. And if you go to Steamboat on a weekend right now in the winter, it's mostly Texans anyway. So that kind of is proven true. Now, this is the historical province of Texas. And you can see that they pretty much doubled the land mass of Texas with their declaration of what the borders were. Let me show you one last thing on here. The strip of land that was between the Rio Grande River and the Nueces River here was called the Nueces Strip. This is where the war between the US and Mexico would start, over that contested land. Okay. Now, in 1845, Texas was annexed by the United States. It became the 28th state. It was admitted as a slave state. And if you look at what Texas' motivation was at the time, they were really threatened by war with Mexico. They needed an ally, the United States. And more importantly, they were about bankrupt, and they needed a bailout. And the US viewed Texas annexation as complicated because it could be viewed as an act of war by Mexico, and in fact it was. And also there was the issue of slavery. And there was a balance between free and slave states in the US. Admitting Texas as a slave state would throw that out of balance and favor slavery. And not only that, they didn't know if Texas was going to be one or many states. So that was problematic, but President Polk, who could be described as an expansionist Democrat, tried to buy New Mexico and California no less than 6 months before the war broke out. He was rebuffed by the Mexicans, but he viewed Mexico as a barrier to manifest destiny. Now, that's a term that was coined in about 1845 by the press in New York. And what it meant was this God-given right for the US to unfold its wings from sea to shining sea, and Mexico was a barrier to that. In 1846, Polk ordered Zachary Taylor and some troops to build a fort in the Nueces Strip across the Nueces River. And there was armed conflict. The Mexicans got the better of it, and the cry went up, American blood shed on American soil. And within 2 weeks, war was declared. Now, we call it the Mexican-American War when you're north of the border. When you're south of the border, it's called the Intervención Estadounidense in Mexico. So they had a total different view. It was an incursion. It was an invasion by America. And when the war started, Stephen Watts Kearny, who was a general in the Army, mustered the Army of the West and set out to New Mexico to take New Mexico. And he did in a bloodless fashion. He was then planning to move on to California, which he did. And what they found was that there were no dependable maps of the Southwest or actionable cartography, maps that you could actually take troops and march them some particular way. The Army was provided 2 maps. These 2 maps, we have a copy of the Mitchell map in the back and a Tanner map of the United States of Mexico. It was printed in English. It was the lower southwestern quadrant of that larger North American map that we had looked at. These are both based on Humboldt cartography, by the way. And just to prove that to you, if you look at the Tanner map, 1846, and you look at the Gila River, which was going to be the route to get to the Mojave Desert, to get to San Diego, there was no more detail on that map than in the 1811 Humboldt map. These are identical maps. So in 35 years, there was no progress made in Southwest cartography. Now, along with Kearney were 4 topographic engineers, and 2 of them, Aber and Peck, were left in the Rio Grande Valley and did a very detailed map of the Rio Grande Valley. We have a copy of that at the back of the room. And Kearney went on with Stephen Watts. I'm sorry, Emery went on as the main cartographer with Stephen Watts Kearney, and there was another group, the Mormon Battalion, that went south with wagons, the logistical support. And what they found very quickly was they couldn't take a wagon along the upper Gila River, which they initially intended, but they had to go significantly south. Along the way, Emery, who was probably the premier topographical engineer in the US Army at the time. By the way, these guys were all West Point graduates. They were highly trained in science and cartography, made 2,000 astronomical observations. He did 900 barometric readings. He studied ruined pueblos, ancient hieroglyphics, plants, animals, and the people of the Southwest. And it's a fabulous report. We have his map from that report also in the back of the room. Now, his map and book, which really became the guidebook for the Southwest for many years, is really one of the best works by the topographical engineers. Now, Aber and Peck looked at the Rio Grande Valley and drew this map. And the only thing I want to point out to you is they didn't go very far south. They sure didn't get to El Paso. In fact, they never got within 90 miles of El Paso. And the Americans still didn't know where El Paso was exactly. But trust me, Pedro Garcia Conde did. Oops. Now, this is Emery's map of the Gila. And this part was impassable for wagons. So Cook took his wagons way southwest and then met up again where it was passable with wagons. If you look at this map, Tucson would be about right here. Phoenix would be about right here. Neither of them, Tucson existed, Phoenix didn't at the time. And this Cook's Wagon Road was felt by the topographical engineers to be the preferred place to bring across a transcontinental railroad. So they were thinking ahead. It was very doable in their mind. And in fact, they thought it was the only practical route. That's Cook's Wagon Road there. Now, I just have to show you this. These are some of the lithographs that came along with Emery's great report. And you can see the variety of things: pueblos, plants, animals, hieroglyphics, and the people of the Southwest trends report. Now, the war ended in 1848, and Polk, just prior to the end of the war, sent his negotiator, a guy named Nicholas Trist, to negotiate the treaty. And this ended the conflict. But keep in mind, at this point, Mexico's ports were blocked by a superior American Navy. Their largest cities were occupied by American troops, and the army was defeated and dispersed in many areas. The nation of Mexico was going to be reduced in size and population dramatically by these negotiations. Now, in 1848, they signed the Treaty of Peace, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it contained 23 articles. 22 of them were accepted by Congress and 1 was rejected. The one that was rejected was one that protected Spanish land grants in the United States. And so Bev's family is real familiar with that. Article 5 contained provisions for the land cessions. Again, they were 525,000 square miles, or 55% of Mexico, and the treaty was signed. Now, Article 5 actually defined the boundary, and it contained impactful language. I think it's interesting to note that they called out the southern and western limits of New Mexico and mentioned that those would be the limits laid down on the map, and that the Disternell map would be incorporated into the treaty. Now, they also said that we're going to appoint a commissioner and a surveyor from each side, and they would designate the boundary on authoritative maps. They would put markers on the ground, and the results that they agreed upon would be viewed as part of the treaty itself. Now, this is the Disternell map that we keep referring to. This is the treaty map, the one that Angel said was deeply flawed, and he was correct. It has a nice history of its own. It was printed in Spanish, but in New York. There were 23 separate editions of this map, and 7 of them were printed in 1847 alone. During the war, it just sold like hotcakes. I have no idea why it's so expensive today, but it's right up there. It was attached to the treaty. The Mexicans attached a different version than the Americans, but they were not materially different in any way that affected the treaty. Now, all of these maps came from the Tanner map. Oh, okay, I'm getting a little frustrated here, guys. All of these maps came from the Tanner map of North America. We also have a copy of this in the back, and we can unfold it after the meeting to take a look at. But it is a wonderful map. Again, the Southwest was done by Humboldt. That map, they took the southwest corner, published it separately as the United States of Mexico. It's a pretty rare map and an excellent map. It's identical to the southwest of the Tanner map. Again, this is the White, Gallagher, and White map, which was printed in New York in Spanish by White, Gallagher, and White. And they got the rights to this map from the Tanner publisher. And then, interestingly, the Disternell map, the treaty map, was printed from the same plates that they printed the White, Gallagher from. So Disternell bought the plates from White, Gallagher, and White. They re-engraved this portion up here, which was Fremont's Great Basin. That was an improvement in the map. But other than that, it was identical. Now, this is the relevant boundary area. It was basically follow the Rio Grande River up to what was called the initial point on the Rio Grande River, and that's the southern border of New Mexico. Then out the southern border of New Mexico, up to the Gila River, out the Gila River to its junction with the Colorado, and then from there out to 1 nautical league south of the San Diego harbor. And this was the border. Seemed very straightforward. If you were writing that treaty, you'd have no trouble writing that down. But executing that and actually marking it and dealing with some of the problems that they ran into is going to be a bit complicated. Now, the parallel to this, I'm going to take a little side trip here. The Senate wanted to know what they had gained, what was ceded to them. In 1848, really get to the Rio Grande River to start surveying from there until 1850. And the request came from Jefferson Davis, a senator from Mississippi, same Jefferson Davis that was the president of the Confederacy, by the way. And they were interested in marking the boundary, knowing what was there, defending it, and most importantly, top of the list was connectivity. They wanted to connect the forts on the Red River, Fort Washita, the forts on the Arkansas, Fort Smith, to El Paso. They wanted to connect San Antonio to El Paso, and then along Cook's Wagon Road or some variant of Cook's Wagon Road out to San Diego, and connect the US to the Pacific Ocean and develop this transcontinental commerce. Now, I want to show you this map. This is the best map of Texas in 1849. It's the Cordoba Map, and what is important in this map is they don't even show West Texas on this. They just show this kind of blank area here. And they really did not know what was in West Texas, and they sure didn't know how to connect it. Now, I would say that this was all empty territory in the Trans-Pecos West, except if you were a Comanche or Indian, you would say, no, this is where we live. The Apaches were in this area, the Comanche were in this area. The other thing I want to point out is how vast this area is. It was closer, San Antonio was closer to New Orleans than San Antonio was to El Paso. So this is this huge, unexplored, unmapped area with no named towns till you got to the Rio Grande River. And what followed was an all hands on deck intent, and they actually developed several routes of connectivity. The first one was by a Captain Marcy, and he went out along the Canadian River to the Rio Grande Valley, went down the Rio Grande Valley to Dona Ana, did not go further south than that, and then back along the Pecos River, and then up back to the Red River and Fort Washita. Now, what's also interesting was this route was believed by the topographical engineers to be the preferred route for a transcontinental railroad. It was flat, it was firm, there was no obstruction, and it didn't have ice and snow on it anytime during the year. So this was the preferred route. And the other thing that's very interesting is that this route crossed the head of every major river in Texas. And from a commercial point of view, their thought was, we'll bring the riches of Texas cotton and cattle, we'll connect it at the railheads, we'll go down the rivers to the Gulf of Mexico. And this was really destined to be the commercial center. Now, the other two routes were what's called the Upper Immigrant Road in blue, the Lower Immigrant Route in red, and they had multiple routes to get to El Paso at this point. Then the plan is you go ahead and you connect with Cook's Wagon Road, get back to the Gila, out the Gila, and get on over to San Diego. So that was the plan. And if you want to know more about this topic, on the Rocky Mountain Map Society webpage is a link to the explorations of the topographical engineers. Now, let's get to the Boundary Commission at this point. The U.S. appointed a fellow named Weller as the commissioner and a fellow named Gray. Mexico appointed Conde and Salazar, and they met in San Diego in 1849. And the president that appointed Weller was Polk, but he didn't last because a Democrat was replaced by a Whig, President Taylor, and he wanted Weller out of there. And they actually got the survey done from San Diego to the junction at the Colorado, but then they wanted to replace him. And the initial planned replacement was John Fremont, the pathfinder, the great explorer of the West, the topographical engineer. And he initially said he'd do it. He dilly-dallied around for a while and then said, no, I think I'm going to run for senator of California, which he did, and he won. And actually went on to become the first Republican candidate for president. But President Pierce was now in office and they didn't have a commissioner. So they appointed a fellow named John Bartlett. And his first task was to survey from the initial point, southern border of New Mexico, on the Rio Grande River. His surveyor was delayed in Texas due to illness. Now, he was negotiating with this fellow, Pedro Garcia Conde, who, as I mentioned, was highly qualified, he surveyed Chihuahua, he knew where El Paso was, and he oversaw the assembly of a map which was not widely spread at that time of the nation of Mexico. Bartlett, on the other hand, was a political appointee. He was unqualified. He was an intellectual. He owned a bookstore in New York. He was an amateur ethnologist, and he went to Washington to hope to become the ambassador to Denmark. This is the guy that wound up there. There's Dr. Paula Rebert that wrote a book, La Grande Linea. It's detailed to the point of torture. It's an excellent book. And she wrote about Bartlett, a political appointee without qualifications in surveying or cartography. He did have literary and artistic talents, but his quarrelsome temperament and his misdirection of the commission eventually led to its breakdown. Although the commissioner for 2 years and numerous surveys were conducted during his tenure, none of them contributed to the final boundary map. When I read this, it had an eerie resonance with my 9th grade English evaluation. And so in any event, this was the guy that went up against Conde. That's Bartlett. That's Bartlett. Oh, back to it. He wasn't a bad looking guy. Very serious looking. Now, let's talk about this controversy of the map. Bartlett got there, Gray was delayed. It was clear in his negotiations with Conde that there was errors in the map. El Paso was 37 minutes of latitude too far north, that's 35 miles. And the longitude was off by an amazing 1 degree, 51 minutes. That's 117 miles off. And this made Mexico on the Disternell map look bigger north to south and wider east to west. And then the other question came up, if the river was not in the right place, which it wasn't, how wide was the southern border of New Mexico? And the question that came up was, do you use the numeric longitude and latitude written on the map as authoritative, or do you use the visual relationship supported by the scale of the map? Let me try and give you a little perspective on that. This is where El Paso was on the map. If you looked at the actual longitude and latitude, it was here. If you then get the, okay, I'll use this. Okay, I'm sorry, guys. I really apologize for this. Get these stuck. I really need to get to the right slide, unfortunately. Oh, there it is. If you get the river on the map in the proper position, this is what it would look like. Now, by the way, that put El Paso 117 miles into Texas. So we can say for certain that this was not a good map. Now, if you recall, Conde had the correct position of El Paso below the 32nd parallel, but the northern boundary of Chihuahua above the 32nd parallel. And they negotiated, and they came up with a settlement. Bartlett said, I'll give you the latitude of El Paso, you give me the width of New Mexico. So he traded latitude for longitude. And he felt really good about this. He said, we're going to get access to these mines in New Mexico, the Santa Rita copper mines, which turned out to be, fabulous copper mines. And Mexico could keep this area they had recently populated that we'll talk about called the Mesilla Valley. And they set the initial point at 32 degrees, 22 minutes. And they had a ceremony. They placed a marker. And then Bartlett went off on a tour of Mexico and California. And he was really not that interested in the surveying aspect. His surveyor, Gray, recovered and arrived to find that they put El Paso at 30 above the 32nd parallel. And he said, that's an inexcusable blunder. And he refused to sign the agreement, and then went on to state that you had to have agreement from the surveyor and the commissioner. And that got bounced back to Congress after a lot of debate in Congress. They basically said, we're not going to fund any further surveying on the Boundary Commission unless you locate El Paso where it's shown on the map. And they did fund a completion of the survey of the lower Rio Grande River below El Paso, but nothing more was going to happen on the westward movement of that survey line. And they disbanded the boundary survey, as amazing as that might sound. So they were in an impasse. Now, what did that actually mean? This is published in the Congressional Record. And by the way, the Congressional Record, sometimes reading it is like eating cardboard, and sometimes it's actually pretty informative. In this case, it was actually pretty informative. And they had a robust discussion. And what happens is, and I like it on this commercial map, which showed the area. The red is the line that corresponded to 8 miles above the actual location of El Paso. The blue line is where Bartlett and Conde negotiated it. And if you say, really between that, if you move that north to where Conde wanted it, the US was giving up 6,000 roughly square miles of territory they felt that they were entitled to. Now, that doesn't sound like much in the big picture. That was only about 1.25% of the secession, but it was right where they wanted to put the railroad. So it was a problem. And if you look at this, this was the disputed territory, and Cook's Wagon Road or some variant of that, because it probably wouldn't have gone that deep, went right through that disputed territory. So both sides wouldn't budge. The Mexicans said, we came to an agreement, we had a ceremony, we marked it, we're done. And the Americans said, we're not going to accept that. And let's talk about that Mesilla Valley just a little bit. Basically, by the way, the treaty that was going to resolve this was known in America as the Gadsden Purchase, but in Mexico it was the sale of Mesilla, or the Treaty of anything. Okay. Now, the Mesilla Valley was a narrow strip along the Rio Grande and the Camino Real, the road that connected Santa Fe to Chihuahua. And it was developed under Mexican land grants from Chihuahua. And basically what was going on was Texas now went up to the Rio Grande River, and Santa Fe and Taos were now in Texas. And by the way, Dona Ana and Las Cruces was now in Texas. And a lot of the Mexican citizenry was understandably uncomfortable with that. The Texans were speculating in land. They were selling things called head rights grants and really displacing Mexican citizens. And that was a violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the most egregious thing was that the head of the garrison, the military garrison in Dona Ana, bought a head right grant for $75 for a square mile of Texas, which just happened to include the entire town of Dona Ana. And that got reversed, by the way, but the Mexicans really wanted to get out. A lot of them came from Santa Fe. Most of them came from Las Cruces and Dona Ana, and they went across the river, and they went below what they believed the border was going to be, which was the Bartlett Conde line that had been negotiated. But unfortunately, negotiations had actually broken down at that point. Enter this guy, his name was William Carr Lane, and he was the appointed governor of New Mexico. And he felt it was his duty as an American to assert sovereignty over the region. And he communicated that in an 8-page, really horrible letter to this fella, Angel Trias, who was the governor of Chihuahua. He claimed the Mesilla Valley, and Trias said, no, and we will resist you with force. And by the way, resorting to force would have been a violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It went back and forth. It was inflamed in the press, and tensions continued to rise. Lane told Trias he could take the territory by force. Trias said Bartlett Conde was settled, and he rallied 800 troops and brought them to El Paso and got Zacatecas and Durango to agree to support Chihuahua should hostilities break out. This guy Lane then went to the military commander of New Mexico and said, I need your help. And his response was, you're not getting it. And he referred the matter to Washington. The U.S. minister to Mexico, the American, said, you need to gracefully change your attitude, basically. And President Pierce, who was an expansionist Democrat, pulled him from the governorship and appointed another governor. So we avoided conflict, but armed conflict almost occurred again over the Mesilla Valley. So enter James Gadsden. He was sent to Mexico to try and resolve this problem because we had a treaty map that didn't work. We had treaty lines that didn't work. The boundary survey was dissolved. He was given the authority to purchase the Mesilla Valley and whatever else he needed for the railroad and whatever else he could buy. And Gadsden was a railroad man. He had an authorization to spend up to $50 million. And by the way, that's more than 3 times what reparations went to Mexico after the Mexican-American War under Guadalupe Hidalgo. Santa Anna was concerned that the U.S. would take the area by force, and that $12 million that he initially got at the end of the war was by this time gone. And Mexico was broke. And he wanted to sell territory, but the question is how much? Now, Gadsden presented 5 options to the Mexican negotiators, and the amount of dollars would depend on how much land they got. And 2 of the 5 options included the Baja. That's how aggressive that they were. And this was the Bartlett Conde line. And by the way, we have a fabulous map, belongs to History Colorado in the back. You should look at it. It actually has this line drawn on it, the Bartlett Conde line. And this is what Gadsden wanted to buy. That was the $50 million offer. By the way, that's about 185,000 square miles of Mexico more that he wanted after already 55% of the country being ceded. Well, that was not accepted by Mexico, but they did negotiate this area down here, which it was Sonoran Desert, but it's southern Arizona and part of New Mexico, and it included the Mesilla Valley right here. And that was termed the Gadsden Purchase or the Treaty of Mesilla that did that. And it was about 30,000 square miles, not 185,000 square miles. Now, the last person I want to talk about is Emery. Emery was, if I've expressed respect for Pedro Garcia Conde, I'm also going to express respect for Emery. Emery was a topographer. He was probably the top guy at the time. He was a topographer for Kearny's Army of the West. He participated in every one of the 4 leaders of the boundary survey. However, when they threw Fremont's name around, he resigned. And the reason was Fremont was another well-known topographer. He's a well-known topographer. He accompanied Kearny out west. Fremont was on an expedition which was unauthorized in Mexico and California. And when the war broke out, he was heavily involved in the Bear Flag Rebellion. And he felt that he was the commander of California. And when Stephen Watts Kearny arrived, he said, I'm your superior officer, I'm in charge. They had a conflict. Fremont was court-martialed and convicted of insubordination. And the guy that testified against him was Emery. So they didn't get along. They had a lot of history. And when they did the Treaty of Mesilla, they did appoint him as both surveyor and astronomer and surveyor. And basically he got that done with cooperation of Mexico very, very quickly. This is his map, which was published in this report. It's another fabulous report, and it has the boundary survey on there. And this is what the new boundary looked like. Now, what I want to kind of finish up with is how did the boundary actually get drawn? And it was a cooperative effort between skilled Mexican surveyors and skilled American surveyors. A lot of times they worked together on the same area. Sometimes The Mexicans would do an area and then have it signed off by the Americans and vice versa. The Americans had a bigger contingent, little better equipment. I know what I'm doing. I'm touching the computer where I shouldn't. Now, what happened here was they put together 54 sectional maps, and side by side, they created a 2,000-mile border. These were done in manuscript. They were never printed. They're held in the archives of the US. They're held in the archives of Mexico, and only a few of them have been scanned. I called up, didn't call them up. I wrote the archives, and they were very helpful. They said, we don't have scanned copies of these, but we're in Bethesda, Maryland. You're welcome to come out and take a look at them, which I didn't do, by the way. But they actually were quite good. Now, there's a couple of scan maps that we can look at, and this is very typical of what these maps look like. This is section 28, which is right here. It's right below El Paso, and this is very typical. It is a wonderfully drawn manuscript map, but it doesn't go a mile off the river in either direction. And it was really a border survey. And if you look at the detail again, it's very nicely drawn. And as Angel pointed out, that river tends to move. And that's a problem with that river. When you have a spring runoff, the course of the El Paso change, of the Rio Grande changes. And in fact, there's villages that were on the west side of the river when they started the survey, which wound up on the east side of the river after the survey was completed. And those were just below El Paso. So it's a very interesting question of international law. There's been a lot of law about that, but beautifully detailed map. Now, my favorite one is map 29, and this one is scanned. And this is the El Paso area. And this one shows more detail than you usually see on these maps. And if you look at this, El Paso is here. Now, today that's Juarez, Mexico. El Paso was developed on the Texas side of the border. The river's the border. Here's the initial point, 8 miles above El Paso, and then it goes west. And this is what the border looks like there. But you can also see how El Paso is in a natural defensive position. It's on the other side of a steep canyon that the river passes through. And it was a very favorable position. The last map that we're going to look at is one that was done by Mexicans in the Spanish language. And this was the initial point on the Pacific Ocean. Here's the border. And if you look at this, it's the border headed toward the junction of the Gila and the Colorado. And it is one.
Denver's up by 10.
Ooh, cool.
I have no idea what that was. I think it was someone at home. One nautical league below the Bay of San Diego. Taking you through a lot of maps and a lot of history. And I'm happy to entertain any discussion, any challenges, any questions. And let's go ahead and open it up if we can. Go ahead, yeah.
Got a little confused. What side did the sail down there?
It was on the Texas side. I'm sorry? Yes, he asked where the ceremonial marker was at the initial point of the Bartlett Conde negotiated line. It was on the Texas side. It's still there today, I believe.
I think you decide 8 nautical miles, or not nautical, 8 miles north of El Paso it started.
Yeah, good question. How did they decide it was 8 miles north of El Paso? Because if you look at the Disternell Treaty map and you measure the distance between the southern boundary of New Mexico and the location of El Paso on that map, it was 8 miles when you use the scale of the map to measure it. Okay, I know. Oh, more questions? Yeah.
Bit of trivia, I think I lied about this, but at the time of Santa Ana and the Texas Rebellion in the Alamo, maybe Mexicans, the Maya, were at war, trying to secede from Mexico. And they sought help from President Polk, naval help. And he turned it down. Otherwise, you might have had to move down as a state too.
I don't doubt that. And I have to tell you, a lot of people after the Mexican-American War said, we won Mexico. It's ours. And Polk didn't want to face years of guerrilla warfare. But I don't doubt at all what you said, Jim. Yeah, I think that's true.
The article that the Congress didn't accept in the treaty, the one that
Mhm.
affected a lot of the land grant people.
Mhm.
Did the U.S. Congress inform the Mexican government and that was not going to be accepted?
Yeah, they did. They basically threw that Article 10 out. Now, what they did was they replaced it with a format to adjudicate those land grants. And so what had to be done was you had to make an application to Congress. It would be reviewed, and then that application would be accepted, rejected, or modified. Part of it was just in relation to my wife's family. She had one land grant in the family that was somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million acres, just south of the Arkansas. There's no way they were going to say, okay, you've got 1 million acres. And they kind of limited it to multiples of 48,000 acres, still a lot. And that was adjudicated by the Congress. Now, that got delayed by the Civil War. So those land grants weren't adjudicated until the 60s. Now, on the other hand, they had another land grant in their family by Wagon Mound. It's called the Nolan Grant. And that was 500,000 acres. And that one actually was returned to the family. But it took adjudication. It's just a little detail I think is interesting. You had to have witnesses to say that you lived on the land and that you worked the land. And in both those land grants in her family, the witnesses, one of them was Saron St. Vrain, and the other one was Christopher Carson. And then they had another one, which was a cousin, and that's who we'll never hear of. But
then is that what the Texans were stomping all over? They were just ignoring those land grants. So,
as Texans may be inclined to do, yes. I hope nobody on the line is from Texas. I was really nice. I didn't say much. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm a little confused. El Paso was always intended to be on the US side. It was just where Texas was located. El Paso was located.
Yeah. It was never going to be on the US side. And when they negotiated, they said El Paso, which is today Juarez, okay? So when I say El Paso, I'm talking about the modern city of Juarez.
Where Juarez was actually located.
Right.
Was the issue. And then from that you went up to.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But you know, that's a city that lives on two sides of that river. And El Paso got the name, but Juarez was the original El Paso.
You know how they got 1 degree, 57 minutes, or whatever it is, off on longitude?
Yeah, it really dates back to Aerosmith's map of Texas. I mean, it was just off. I mean, it just going way back. I mean, they didn't do longitude and latitude as accurately when that river was placed. And you really, they used a lot of, and how maybe you can help me, a lot of triangulation initially, which is very good, but very hard to do. It can have a lot of errors, and they eventually switched to a lot of astronomical observations. And those were more accurate than the old ones. But once that got embedded into the cartography, it just got carried forward. And to be honest with you, the Americans really did not know the exact location because they never surveyed it before the war. Conde did, but Bartlett didn't. And you know, once they got into that period in 1848 to 1850, when they said, let's figure out what we won, and they finally got to El Paso and they finally actually surveyed it, they said, this is really off. Did you have something to say?
Well, yeah, so before the survey, before they figure out the errors, the initial negotiations to end the war. I'm surprised given how little they knew except for what I understood you to say was it was primarily an aspirational idea of that being the southern route. In other words, that explains why they were looking for that southern border.
Right. Right. They felt that was the only practical route for a railroad, and they probably wouldn't have gone as far south. They didn't need to go as far south as Cook went. Now, that railroad, that was going to be the only possible solution for a transcontinental railroad, and that's what the topographical engineers felt. It didn't get built until almost 1890 because of the Civil War. And, you know, the U.S. Congress wasn't going to support a southern railroad route, given all the tensions that were going on at the time. There's a lot more to say about what was going on at the border. It's very interesting. When they did the Gadsden Treaty, the Treaty of Messina, they really had other issues that they had to deal with at the time. One of them was Article 11, which said we're going to defend the border against raids from Mexico, from the United States into Mexico, from the Indian population. That was not a doable task. It really wasn't. And so they had that pulled out. There was some other issues that they dealt with, but that was, I think did I answer your question?
Maybe this is for both.
Yeah, sure.
Are the Americans in a position to pretty much ask for what they want for that southern? They have that much hand, so to speak, in 1848.
Angel?
In fact, you're right. They wanted to take it in more.
Yeah.
In the negotiations.
It's under the Gadsden version, right? No, it's later.
Oh, the original. Yeah. You know, on one of my slides, I made a point, and that when Trist went down to do the initial treaty, the cities were occupied. The big cities were occupied by American troops. Mexico City was occupied. They had 2 ships in the Mexican Navy, and we had a robust Navy in both the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico. They blockaded all the ports, and in conflict, the U.S. had better weaponry, and they defeated, you know, valiant Mexican soldiers, but they were defeated. They really had no choice, and besides, they were bankrupt before the war. And they owed money all over the world. And one of the other points on the slide, I didn't emphasize it, was they reduced the size of the nation and they reduced the population of the nation. They did not reduce the debt of the nation. So they still had to support all this debt that they had generated over many, many years. Angel, is that a fair way to look at it? So they couldn't have gone to war with the U.S. again. I mean, it would have been senseless. So. Okay. Yeah, let's take 2 more questions. Go ahead, Jim, and we'll get you.
I think, I don't know my socialist, but there was a railroad attempted from Kansas City to Chihuahua to Los Mochis. I think only the southernmost part of that was built over the Sierra Madre. But it was intended to start Kansas City into dealing in cattle and hides and things into the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, the Gulf of California. How did that fare in all of this? You know anything about it? Was it earlier or later?
No, I don't know. He's asking if there was a railroad from Kansas City to the Gulf of California. And no, I don't know about that. I do know that there was a plan to build a railroad across Mexico above what was, we talked about this on how Tepa what? No, it was an isthmus, but above yes, they were going to build a railroad across Mexico, and it was heavily involved by American investors. You know, actually, there was a guy named Garcia who was Mexican. He got a land grant to build the railroad. That got sold to a British consortium. They sold it to a New York consortium. And part of what Gadsden went down to negotiate was to protect American business interests in that railroad. But that's the only railroad that I know of that would have gone from the Gulf of Mexico over to the Gulf of California.
And they expected to go back to foreign provisions or within the state anyway. So, what was negotiating not acceptable? And what would have happened to the overall context of the treaty if it had been completed?
Yeah. First of all, you're exactly right. Polk got frustrated with how long it was taking him to get the treaty done. And finally, he just said, I'm recalling you. I'm pulling you out. We'll get somebody else in there that can get the job done. He felt two things. One is I understand the Mexican negotiating posture. And two, I can get it done. No internet, that finished treaty, which he did very quickly, to Washington, and it was basically a fait accompli. And it was a deal that, okay, it was a good negotiation. But Polk did decide to pull him back. Yeah, he was just frustrated because he couldn't get the job done, he said. Okay, well, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was a fantastic view of the line. Like I was saying, this went on and on and on. In fact, at the end of the 1800s, there was a gentleman who had a little farm in El Paso, close to El Paso. And overnight, the river changed course. So the next day, he was in the U.S. side. He was a U.S. citizen. But believe it or not, he didn't want to be in the U.S. He actually wanted to be a Mexican. And so that created a problem with the chamizal. I don't know if you ever heard this. There was a no man's land in El Paso, and nobody could agree what was that. And actually, I remember when I was a kid, I used to go to El Paso, and there was this place that people didn't want to touch. They were not from Mexico. They were not from the U.S. It was this no man's land. It was not until President Kennedy in 1963 actually visited Mexico and said, all right, let's finish this. This has been going for too long. And it was not until Johnson that finally they created it's a park now, a park that is part of the United States, and there's another park on part of the Mexico. And who knows when it's going to go on, when this is going to finish, but it keeps going. But thank you so much, and we'll hope to see you 2 weeks from now. And now we're really focused down in Colorado to the city of Denver, and that's when Tom Overton is going to be talking to us about that. So hope to see you in 2 weeks. See you.